We're now going to continue the reading of the Martin Luther King speech entitled Birth of a New Nation. At this point, Prime Minister Nkrumah had just been elected, and we're going to pick up from there. Then came Tuesday, December the 5th, and many events leading up to it. That night we walked into the closing of Parliament. The closing of the old Parliament which was presided over by the British Empire. The old Parliament which designated colonialism and imperialism. Now that Parliament is closing, that was a great sight and a great picture and a great scene. We sat there that night. Just about 500 were able to get in. People, thousands and thousands of people, waiting outside, but only 500 were actually in there. And we were fortunate enough to be sitting there at that moment as guests of the Prime Minister. And at that hour we noticed that Prime Minister Nkrumah walking in with all of his ministers, his justices of the Supreme Court of the Gold Coast, and with all of the people of the Convention People's Party, the leaders of that party. Nkrumah came up to make his closing speech to the old Gold Coast. There was something old now passing away. The thing that impressed me more than anything else that night was the fact that Nkrumah walked in, and his other ministers who had been in prison with him. They didn't come in with crowns and all of the garments of kings, but they walked in with prison caps and coats that they had lived with for all of those months that they had been in prison. Nkrumah stood up and made his closing speech to Parliament with the little white cap that he wore in prison for several months and the coat that he wore in prison for several months, and all of his ministers around him. That was indeed a great hour. An old Parliament passing away. And then at 12 o'clock that night, we walked out. As we walked out, we noticed all over the polo grounds about 500,000 people. They had waited for this hour and for this moment for years. As we walked out the door and looked at the beautiful building, we looked up to the top of it, and there was a little flag that had been flowing around the sky for many years. It was the Union Jack flag of the Gold Coast, the British flag, you see. But at 12 o'clock that night, we saw a little flag coming down, and another flag went up. The old Union Jack flag came down, and the new flag of Ghana went up. This was a new nation now, a new nation being born. And when Prime Minister Nkrumah stood up before his people out in the polo grounds and said, "We are no longer a British colony. We are a free, sovereign people." All over the vast throng of people we could see tears, and I stood there thinking about so many things. Before I knew it, I started weeping. I was crying for joy, and I knew about all of the struggles and all of the pain and all of the agony that these people had gone through for this very moment. And after Nkrumah had made that final speech, it was about 12:30 now. We walked away, and we could hear little children 6 years old and old people 80 and 90 years old walking the streets of Accra crying, "Freedom, freedom." They couldn't say it in the sense that we say it. Many of them don't speak English too well, but I could hear their accents and it would ring out, "Freedom, freedom." They were crying it in the sense that they had never heard it before, and I could hear that old Negro spiritual once again crying out, "Free at last, free at last. Great God Almighty, I'm free at last." They were experiencing that in their very souls, and everywhere we turned, we could hear it ringing out from their housetops. We could hear it from every corner, every nook and crook of the community. Freedom, freedom. This was the birth of a new nation. This was the breaking loose from Egypt. Wednesday morning, the official opening of the Parliament was held. There again, we were able to get on the inside. There Nkrumah made his new speech. And now the Prime Minister of the Gold Coast, with no superior, with all of the power that Macmillan of England has, with all of the power that Nehru of India has, now a free nation, now the Prime Minister of a sovereign nation. The Duchess of Kent walked in. The Duchess of Kent, who represented the Queen of England, no longer had authority now. She was just a passing visitor now. The night before, she was the official leader and spokesman for the Queen, thereby the power behind the throne of the Gold Coast. But now it's Ghana. It's a new nation now, and she's just an official visitor like Martin Luther King and Ralph Bunche and Coretta King and everybody else, because this is a new nation. A new Ghana has come into being. And now Nkrumah stands, the leader of the great nation. And when he drives out, the people standing around the streets of the city after Parliament is open to cry out, "All hail Nkrumah," the name of Nkrumah crowning around the whole city. Everybody crying his name because they knew he had suffered for them. He had sacrificed for them. He had gone to jail for them. This was the birth of a new nation.